Hello and welcome, my friends. Alonso here. Today is a great day to learn about subtractive synthesizers, subtractive synthesis, especially if you're a synthwave producer. It comes in very handy to know at least how to edit the patches, the sound banks that you have for your favorite synthesizers, and if not, be able to create patches, custom patches from scratch. I always find that to be super rewarding and exciting. Like to make my own patches so music that I make sounds more like me. All right, great, my friend. So, like I mentioned, today it's all about subtractive synthesis, and we're gonna go on a journey, that's for sure. Before we get started, well, the lay of the land for today is first we're gonna cover from a conceptual standpoint the components of a subtractive synthesis system, because I like to think of a synthesizer as a system that has different components, and each component can impact other components in the system as it normally happens. Number two, I want to walk you through a very simple synthesizer that I use a lot, that I've created a lot of tutorials for, which is GR8, which is free and awesome, just to put into action some of the things that we'll cover first conceptually, then see how they play out on a synthesizer. Then I want to make a few patches, put into use what we have learned. And finally, I want to show you my best method for learning and how to develop your subtractive synthesis skills. All right, so possibly we're going to go on for more than an hour, maybe an hour and a half, maybe two. Don't worry about the stream if it's low quality or something, because I'm going to record this, and if there are any problems, I'm going to upload the recording. In any case, this is going to be available over at synthwavedojo.com in a better quality than here on the stream. In any case, let's get started, my friends. Cool. First of all, what is subtractive synthesis? Subtractive synthesis is a method of sound synthesis in which partials of an audio signal are attenuated by a filter to alter the timbre of the sound. And this is straight from Wikipedia. So what do we make of this? So first of all, subtractive synthesis, we make sound first, and then we take something away. That's what the filter does by attenuating certain frequencies. We take something away, and we end up with something similar than what we started for. And that's the subtractive part of synthesis. Subtractive synthesis can be applied to any source of audio, any source audio signal, but is most commonly associated with analog synthesizers of the 1960s and 70s. So without getting too much in the details, you can apply subtractive synthesis concepts to wavetable synthesis, wave sequencing synthesis, a whole bunch of different synthesis methods, right? But mostly it's associated with the analog synthesizers of the 60s and 70s, and of course the 80s and 90s, and that are still made today. Like I mentioned, I like to think of subtractive synthesis as a system. And this system, in my point of view, has four main elements or four components. And I also like to think of them as starting and going from left to right, kind of following a signal flow path. And for me, conceptually, this helps me to understand the flow inside any synthesizer, right? And it very quickly helps me to get the lay of the land of any new synthesizer that I come across. And the first component of the system on the left-hand side, we have the sound generator, where the sound is actually generated. And typically, this is called an oscillator on almost any synth, okay? An oscillator offers waveforms, or generates waveforms that sound differently. We have sawtooth waveforms, square waveforms, pulses, triangles, sines. And the waveform with the most frequency content, with the most harmonics, the richest one is the sawtooth. Next, we have the square wave. After that, the pulse, the triangle, and the sine. The sine wave is just one fundamental with no harmonics is the simplest of them all, and the most complex is the sawtooth. Great. So once we have generated a sound via the oscillator, then what happens next? That sound goes into a frequency shaper in the form of a filter. As the name frequency shaper suggests, we're going to shape the frequency, okay? We're going to do something with the frequency content of that original waveform. And the filter, what the filter will do is take something away. And there's various kinds of filters. We have low-pass filters, high-pass filters, band-pass filters, and slopes, and a lot of different terms associated with filters that we'll get into later. But the fundamental thing to understand is that when the sound gets to the frequency shaper section or to the filter, we're going to take something away, okay? And that taking away is the subtractive part of synthesis. We start out with something full bandwidth or full harmonics, and then in the filter, in the frequency shaper section, we take something away. Whether it's the low end or the high end or something in between, it doesn't matter, right? We're taking something away. And finally, or not finally, we get to the third stage, which is the amplifier, okay? In the old, or let's say in analog and hardware synthesizers, after the signal, after the harmonic content has been filtered, something has been taken away, we need to amplify that signal so it can be, we can connect our synth to a mixer or to speakers, etc. But that signal needs to be amplified so it can be used further in the audio signal chain, okay? And that's what the amplifier stage is for. We're gonna amplify or increase the level of the signal. Out of all the components of the subtractive synthesis system, for the most part, the amplifier is the most simple to understand. We just take a signal and amplify it or increase its level. That's pretty much it, right? Okay. And the fourth component at the bottom is the modulators. Let me just check if something weird happened here. Because I think something stopped. Can you guys still see me and hear me? Let me check something real quick. Okay, I think we're back. All right, coming back. Modulators. The modulators, think of them as components in the system that don't generate a sound on their own. They just modulate or change other components in the system. And this is very useful. Modulators are found in the, let's call them, they're represented as envelopes and LFOs. We'll talk about what these are, right? But it's very important that envelopes and LFOs can affect the oscillators, can affect the filters, and can affect the amp, and we can make them do very cool things, right? So modulators, they don't generate any kind of sound. They're just controlling parameters within all of the other elements in our subtractive synthesizer system. Great. So this is the, I would say, the 30,000 foot view of how a subtractive synthesizer works. Now let's cover each of these components one by one. First off, the sound generators, the oscillators. In a vintage portable synthesizer, you would typically find between 1 and 2 oscillators. Some of them, like the Minimoog, had 3, but most commonly, you'd had 2. For example, the Prophet, the OBX-A, the OBX, the Jupiter. Most of those synthesizers had 2 oscillators, whereas the Juno had only 1, the Korg Poly6 had only 1, but that's what you would typically find because of the restrictions of the time of creating these components, actual oscillators in the analog world. They were expensive. There's real estate to consider when building a synth. It has to fit a certain form factor, so you couldn't fit 10 oscillators in the same synth. It would be too expensive, etc. However, most modern synthesizers have 2 or more synths like Serum, Ana2, Massive, if I'm not mistaken, at least some of them have maybe 3, 4, 5, or even 6, right? And stacks of synthesizer, of oscillators and voices, etc. So in the digital realm, in the current world that we live in, we don't have the restrictions of the past, right? So modern synths, they have plenty of more options and resources to play with. A very important concept when it comes to the oscillators is polyphony, like monophonic synth, polyphonic synth, and then voices. What's all that about? Well, polyphony of a synth, we can generalize and simplify by saying that polyphony just means how many notes you can play at the same time, okay? So monophonic means that you can only play one note at a time. Polyphonic, poly means many or multiple, you can play many notes at the same time, okay? And how is this useful? Well, for a kind of lead where you typically only play one note, then there are certain options that if you turn a monophonic mode in the voicing, maybe you can access different stuff in your synthesizer. And when you're using a polyphonic mode, you can play chords, 3, 4, 5 notes, or however many notes you want at the same time. But then there's also certain limitations with the number of voices, etc. But we'll get into a little bit of that in a few. But just to summarize, polyphonic means that you can play multiple notes at the same time, monophonic, only one. Now, another important term is voices. Voices, we can simplify as how many oscillators you hear when you play a note on your synthesizer, on your MIDI controller, or in the MIDI editor. When you hold down one note, how many oscillators you hear, we can say that's however many voices you hear, okay? So when you play one note, maybe you can hear just one oscillator, that would be one voice. But if you hear 2 or 3 oscillators at the same time, then that's 2 or 3 or more voices, okay? In the old days, there would be limitations on a synth regarding monophony, polyphony, how many notes you could play, but also the number of voices. Like I said, when you're building hardware synthesizer, analog synthesizer, all the components, they take up real estate and they add to the final cost of the synthesizer. So it's always a balance of how can you make something the way that you want to make it, but still make it affordable. So not all synthesizers, you could play a lot of notes with a lot of voices. For example, the Mini Moog, even though it had 3 oscillators, it was still a monophonic synth. Yeah, when you held down one note, you would hear 2 or 3 oscillators, right? But it was still monophonic. But then the polyphonic synths came along, like let's say the Prophet 5, the Jupiter, the Juno, all of those synths, the Oberheims, and then all of a sudden you can play more notes at the same time, and they had more voices or more oscillators and unison, and we'll get into some of that later. But this is also important to understand that most synths have a limitation in terms of polyphony and voices, but for the most part, you don't need to worry when playing modern synths, since they can usually use up like 16 or 32 voices and tons of polyphony. But just be aware that if you're using an analog emulation like from the Juno or OBXD or OBXA or Prophet, typically there's a limitation on how many voices and how many notes you can play. Right. Another important thing is that the pitch of the oscillators can generally be modulated via LFOs and envelopes. I'm just mentioning that you can control certain parameters of the oscillators via LFOs and envelopes if you so desire. And at the bottom left, we can see screenshots from a synth. This is GR8, a synth that I very much love. It's very useful, it's free, and it sounds great. And we can see here 2 oscillator sections or 2 oscillator blocks. We see oscillator 1, and we can pick different kinds of waveforms. We can set this control to change the octave of the synth. So when I hold down a note, it plays in a higher octave or in a lower octave. Then we see oscillator 2 that it also offers us different kinds of waveforms for our sound. But then we see 2 additional knobs, one of them semi and cent. Semi is for detuning oscillator 2 from oscillator 1, but using semitones, like musical semitones. This is useful if you wanted to create like a 5th lead, which has a note and a 5th above it. Then we would set this semitone knob to an interval of a perfect 5th, which is 7 semitones, or a perfect 4th, which is 5 semitones, or an octave, whatever. This just helps us detune oscillator 2 in a musical interval that can be useful. Cent is just tinier increments than semitones, and it is useful when you want to thicken up a sound, so you can activate two oscillators and just detune them slightly, a little bit, one from the other, and we'll hear this later on down the road. It thickens up the sound because we can clearly hear the two voices of the oscillator, right? And of course, we can see here a mix knob, so we can set how much of one or the other oscillator we want in our final sound. And here to our right, we have a screenshot of additional parameters that affect the oscillators. Sometimes you find some of these inside the oscillator section. Sometimes there's like a global parameter section. Sometimes there's like a keyboard section. And that's the thing with synthesizers, that every synthesizer has its own way of presenting the graphical user interface in terms of where all the things are laid out. And there is no convention of how to call things. So one synthesizer may call one thing, for example here, this glide parameter, so you can glide from one note to the next or slide from one note to the next. Some synthesizers may call it glide, another one will call it portamento. So it's always a matter of figuring out, reading the controls and reading the manual, figuring out what the parameters are, because no two synthesizers present the same parameters and with the same names and in the same layout. So it's always a matter of discovering your synth. In any case, here we can see that this synthesizer offers us 4 modes, one of them being mono, like I mentioned, monophonic, another one poly for polyphonic, but then it has 2 additional modes, unison and chord. We'll get into this later, but unison is kind of like monophonic, where you can play only one note at a time, at least on this synth, but instead of just one voice, you can stack 8 voices on the same note, and this is very useful. It gives the sound a very a lot of, let's say, width to it and a lot of character and interest. And then we have a chord mode, which, if we set it up in a certain way by holding down or playing just one key on my controller, then the synthesizer will output a full chord, a chord with 4 notes, which is very useful, right? And this is pretty much it when it comes to the oscillator section. This is 80 for the 20, which you'll see. And of course, there are synths that will present many more options than what I covered here, but this is a great start and a great foundation for learning. Next up, we have the frequency shaper component, which is expressed in the form of filters. Let me double check if there aren't any questions here. All right, see Robert, Mick, Enrique, Walter, thank you very much for being here, guys. Appreciate you very much. Cool. All right, filters. As we have already discussed, the filter will take out certain frequencies while letting others pass. And this is the part of the synthesis process where we take out frequencies, where we subtract the frequencies that gives the synthesis technique its name. This is the subtraction part. All right, all subtractive synthesizers will offer at least a low-pass filter, without a doubt. This is the most useful kind of filter. And you may find other kinds of filters, but the low pass is what you'll find on each and every subtractive synthesizer. Some common filter types are the low pass. Okay, the low pass filter lets the low frequencies pass and filters out or subtracts the highs. A high pass, on the other hand, lets the high frequencies pass unaffected and filters out the lows. A band pass filter is a combination of a high pass and a low pass filter because it filters out lows and filters out highs and leaves what we have in the middle. It leaves a band pass through. Cool. Now, how do we determine how strongly we apply a filter to a signal? That that strength of the filter is dictated by what's called the slope or the steepness of a filter. If we were to, and I should have, if we play a note with a frequency analyzer, we can see, and if we apply a filter, we can see that if we apply a steep filter versus a more shallow filter, the steep filter is stronger than a shallow filter, okay? And in synthesizer lingo, the steepness or the slope of the filter is configured with a setting called, well, slope, and you'll see it named differently depending on the synthesizer. For example, common terms are 4-pole or 2-pole, right? 4-pole is steeper than 2-pole, and 4-pole and 2-pole, or the concept of pole, is the same as dB per octave. In this case, a 4-pole filter is the same as a filter with a 24 dB per octave slope. What the dB per octave slope means is that once we apply the filter, the signal will be attenuated at 24 dB at the frequency cutoff point. Okay, so a 12 dB per octave slope is more shallow than a 24 dB per octave slope. So 24 dB or 4-pole is more aggressive, stronger than 12 dB per octave or 2-pole. And typically you'll find one of these mentioned. And sometimes you'll see them in synths like 4P HP, that would stand for 4-pole high pass filter, or maybe it's expressed as 24 dB per octave. As we can see in this screenshot, we have the word slope, and we see -12, -18, and -24. In this case, this filter, in terms of slope, it offers us this 12 dB per octave, and it offers 24 dB per octave, but it has a third choice, somewhere in between, -18 dB per octave, which can be useful, all right? Another important concept is that of filter cutoff control, or filter cutoff. What is that? The filter cutoff control sets the frequency at which the filter attenuates the signal as determined by its slope. Okay, let's unpack that. The frequency cutoff control, when we set it, for example, if I were to turn this knob and set it to 100 Hertz, what this means is that at 100 Hertz, the filter, and if I set it to -12 dB per octave, the filter at 100 Hertz will attenuate the signal by 12 dBs, or it will have extracted 12 dB of the signal. If the slope were 24, and if I set it to 100 Hertz, at 100 Hertz, the filter will take out 24 dB per octave, or will have taken out 24 dB of that signal at that point. Okay, so you can think of it, that's it's almost the point where the filter will take action over the signal. Not necessarily, not quite, but we can simplify it like that. Then we have resonance, peak, or Q, and this value or this control, what it does is it emphasizes the frequencies around the cutoff point, creating a resonant node, creating a resonant sound that is very characteristic of analog synthesis or subtractive synthesis. Enhancing or creating resonance, it creates a very characteristic timbre on the sound. Next up, key tracking. When key tracking is enabled, and it could be called differently, for example, here it's just called key. On some other synths, it's KBD. On others, it just says tracking. That's where I said you need to read the manual or play with your synth to understand what the parameters are. But when key tracking is enabled, the filter cutoff will automatically move up or down, tracking the pitch that you're playing on your controller or the keyboard or on your MIDI editor. And so a high note will make the filter cutoff to rise, while a low note will cause the filter cutoff to go down to where that note is. And this is useful for making high notes brighter. For example, let's say that we set up our filter cutoff at, I don't know, 500 Hertz, okay? And if we play a high note, let's say in the C5 octave, which maybe has its fundamental, I'm going to make this up, but maybe 2.5 kilohertz, right? What will happen is that that high note is going to be very dark when I compare it to a note below the low note below the cutoff. Okay. Now, if I wanted that high note to have more brightness, instead of just raising my cutoff manually, that will create all the other notes in my patch to have more high frequency. And I don't want that. I just want my high notes to be more brilliant, to have more shine on them. Then what I do is I enable keyboard tracking or key tracking and increase that parameter. And what will happen is that high notes will sound brighter while low notes may stay the same or sound a little darker. But in the end, that's what I was going for, my high notes to sound brighter, right? So that's what key tracking is useful for. Then the filter cutoff controlled this, we can modulate or change it via LFOs and envelopes for many different reasons. But it's useful to understand that we can do that. That's possibilities that we have in our system is using LFOs and envelopes to modulate the filter cutoff control. Okay, and this is important because depending on the architecture of your synth, especially if it's a hardware synth, which envelope in your synth controls the filter may be user selectable or may be hardwired. For example, a Juno 106, a Juno 60, or a Juno 6, they only have one envelope to control both the filter and the amp at the same time. Whereas a Prophet 5 has two envelopes. One envelope is hardwired to the amp, and another is hardwired to the filter. Okay? But in a modern synth, like let's say Serum, Massive, or Anna 2 or Pigments, you may have three or more envelopes, and one of them may or may not already be hardwired to the amp, but you could assign the rest of the envelopes to whatever other parameters, so you can select and pick and choose which one you want to use for the filter. And this is useful in many ways. We'll get into some of that later, but just understand that different synths offer different numbers of envelopes, which may or not be hardwired to certain parameters. So that's also part of learning the different architectures of your synths and what they can or can't do. And typically, the simpler the synth, the more of a 60s, 70s, or 80s emulation, at least the cheaper kinds of synths, the less options that they will have, right? And the higher end the original synth was, like a Jupiter, which cost a pretty penny back then in the 80s, you have two filters, actually two envelopes, one for the amp, one for the filter, and some other modulation controls that you didn't have on a Juno, which was a more cheaper option. All right, cool. Next up, the amplifier. At least for me, this is the simplest component to understand. And for the most part, in most synths, it's going to be the simplest section of them all. In most cases, you only have a master volume knob or slider, and that's pretty much it. Okay? And this is also important. I was saying most, if not all, subtractive synths only have one amplifier. I don't know if there's a subtractive synthesizer that has more than one amplifier. If you like FM synthesis, which is not subtractive, each operator has its own amplifier, so it's like a different kind of beast. But I just want to put out there that most subtractive synthesizers, just to not say all of them, in case there's the weird outlier case out there, they have only one amplifier, okay? And the amplifier will typically, like I mentioned, present a volume knob or slider, and this amplifier can be modulated via an LFO or an envelope, and this is useful to make to change the character and the expressiveness of our patch. For example, if you wanted a soft pad kind of sound, you would want the level of the amplifier to have a very soft attack or slow attack, and then a long release, right? Whereas let's say a more kind of aggressive lead, you want the attack of the amp to be immediate and maybe have absolutely no release because you want to play some very fast notes, right? So this is the way that you can control the amplifier depending on the sound and the timbre that you're going for. And also, same as with the other components, depending on the architecture of your synth, which envelope controls the amp may be selectable or it may be already hardwired. Great. Let me just check if there are no questions here. Yeah, let me move my head out of the way. In any case, I've walked you through all the text, so it shouldn't be a problem. Where am I? All right, happy now, Enrique? Hope you are, man. Hope you are. All right. Next up, the final component is the modulators, the envelopes, and the LFOs. Modulators, LFOs, and envelopes, like I mentioned, they don't make any sound, but instead control various parameters of a synth over time. Okay? Think of them as automation sources. So instead of you controlling a certain knob to make a certain kind of movement, you can use an LFO or an envelope to create that kind of movement. LFOs and envelopes are also called modulation sources, okay, while a modulation destination can be any parameter that can be controlled via a modulation source. So for example, let's say that we want to control the filter cutoff with an LFO using the terms modulation source and modulation destination, which you may find on plenty of synths. The modulation source, the one that will create the modulation, in this case, is the LFO, while the parameter receiving the modulation or the destination would be the filter cutoff knob or the filter cutoff control. Right? So always keep that in mind. When it comes to modulation via envelopes or LFOs, there's the source, which is the envelope and the LFO, and there's the destination, which can be the oscillator pitch, the filter frequency, the amp level, etc. There's always a source and there's always a destination. Some synths offer what's called a modulation matrix, which is an interface like this one, and it looks like a matrix. On some synths, it has rows and columns, which is very much a matrix, where you can find and assign all your modulation sources. For example, here on the left-hand side, by clicking on these dots, I can select modulation sources, and then on this right-hand column, I can set the destination of that modulation. So here, for example, we're saying LFO1 is the source, and the destination is going to be the pitch fine of all the oscillators. And then we're going to, with some kind of strength or modulation depth control, we're going to determine how strongly the LFO is going to affect the destination parameter. And in plenty of synths, we can also determine whether that modulation is positive or if it's negative, if it's, what else? Well, some other parameters when it comes to controlling the modulation, right? Not all synths will present a modulation matrix like this. Some other synths, instead of a modulation matrix, what they will have is sprinkled in the interface certain controls that are already hardwired for certain modulations. If we take a look at this filter block from GR8, we see a control labeled LFO, and what this means is that I can, if I turn this up, the LFO will control the filter cutoff. So I don't need to come into a mod matrix and select my source and select the destination and the strength, etc. It has already been predetermined for me. And here I have another modulation option, which is whether I want the cutoff to be controlled by envelope 1 or envelope 2, I can select this. On other synths, the filter will already be hardwired to be controlled by envelope 1, for example, or there may be no two envelopes, so there's just one for both the amp and the filter, etc., right? And, for example, here under the amp section, we see that we have an LFO knob, same as with the filter, that if I turn it up, the LFO will start affecting the level. So it has already been routed for me, okay? So some synths, like Serum, Anna, Massive, if they don't have mod matrices like this, they have something else where pretty much you can use any of your modulation sources to affect almost any parameter inside the synth, but you have to set it up manually, right? In some simpler synths, some of these decisions are already made for you, so it's just simpler to turn this up, right, and start affecting the filter cutoff with the LFO than having to go in and manually select this, the source, the destination, etc., right? So it's a trade-off, and one is not better than the other. It's just different choices. All right, so that's in a general sense the modulators, but let's now cover envelopes and LFOs in more detail. All right, envelope generators, or envelopes, allow a user to control the different stages of a sound. The most common envelope generator is controlled with 4 parameters: attack, decay, sustain, and release. This is what's called an ADSR envelope. It has 4 stages. Each of them, there are attack, decay, sustain, and release. So let's cover them in detail. And this is a depiction of an ADSR envelope, which you'll see online, and many times labeled on the synth. There may be a depiction of the, especially on analog synths from the 80s, very often they would have some kind of image showing the stages of the envelope if they had some kind of uncommon envelope type. In any case, attack. So the attack is the time it takes for our sound to go from 0 to 100% loudness. Okay, so attack is has a value of time. It's the attack time, okay, it takes to go from 0 to maximum level. So from 0 to maximum. Then decay is also time. It's the time it takes for the signal to go from the top of the attack, where the level is at maximum, down to the sustain level. So this is also important. Decay is measured in time. Okay. Sustain is a level. It's not time, such as attack, decay, and release. It's actually a level. And it means that once I've pressed down a key and it has gone from 0 to the top of the attack, to its loudest peak, after the decay time, and if I keep my finger pressing the note, that's the level that the signal will keep, or will keep on going. Okay, it's the level maintained until the key is released. And it's important to mention that this sustained level could be at the top, could be maximum, or could be really low. It could be wherever I want to set it, okay? And very important to point out that if the sustain control is all the way up, imagine that the signal level is here, okay? And the signal, once it finishes the attack time, is here at its maximum amplitude. And if I set the sustain at the maximum amplitude, okay, how long does it take the signal to go from maximum amplitude to maximum amplitude following the sustain? It's immediate. There's no change. In other words, when the sustain control is all the way up, the decay parameter is moot. It's useless. It doesn't do anything. And this is very important for making patches. Once more, when the sustain level control is all the way up, the decay parameter is as if it didn't exist. It doesn't matter where you set it, it will have no effect on the sound. The decay parameter only has an effect when the sustain is different than maximum. because then it would make sense, right? If we set the sustain halfway, okay, yeah, then the decay will control the time that it takes for the signal to go from the top after the attack time and go all the way down to the sustain level. There will be some time taken there as determined by the decay control, but if the sustain control is all the way up, the decay parameter is moot, useless, it doesn't matter. This is very important. So don't let that throw you off. Like you'll see this in patches sometimes that the sustain is at a certain level, let's say at the top actually, and maybe the decay is halfway or at the bottom. It doesn't matter where the decay is as long as the sustain is at the top. Okay, finally, the release is the time it takes for the level to decay from the sustain level down to 0. So if I'm pressing my finger on a note, I'm getting a certain level dictated by the sustain control, but once I let go of the key, how fast will the sound take to go from that sustain level to 0? That's determined by the release control. And of course, it could be immediate, it could be fast, it could be slow, medium, or super slow, however I want to set it, right? And depending on the patch, and depending on the on various different things, like the tempo of your track, you may go with shorter release times. But if you want a pat sound that sustains across bars, then maybe you want a longer release, etc. Now, all subtractive synths offer envelopes to control the filter cutoff and the amp, the volume of the amp. And most synthesizers offer 2 or more envelopes. Modern synthesizers, like I mentioned, while vintage synths like the Juno 106 and the 60 and the 6 had only one envelope to control both the filter and the amp. So what this means from a sound design perspective is that the Juno 6 or the Junos are limited in a certain way because they only have one filter for both the amp and the filter. So you can't make the filter move differently than the amp, and you can achieve that if you have 2 filters. For example, on a Jupiter, on a Prophet 5, or an Oberheim OBXA, you can get certain sounds on those synths that you can't get on a Juno because you don't have the same number of envelopes, right? And that's part of it. The same, there are certain sounds that you can get using Serum. Yeah, it's a wavetable synthesizer, whatever, but it has more options than a Juno, right? So that's part and parcel of understanding your synths. There are certain things you can or can't do. For example, the Juno, it has a dual oscillator. You can activate the two oscillators, the square wave and the sawtooth, at the same time, but you can't tune them to different pitches or semitones. So you that choice is hardwired. So you can't achieve certain patches like you could on a Jupiter, where you can detune the both oscillators to different intervals. And the same, you can achieve certain filter movement different from the amp on a Jupiter or Prophet 5 that you can't get on a Juno. And of course, the Juno is awesome, has other strengths, has other weaknesses, but you need to wrap your head around as you learn your synths that there are certain things that you can't do on one versus the other, right? So, for example, and here I just wanted to show the different envelope sections on different emulation synths that I own. This one's on GR8, and we can see that we have the envelope 1 and envelope 2. The controls are shown as knobs, okay? Whereas this is a Prophet 5V by Arturia, we also get knobs, right? But in the filter, but the envelope is in the filter section. There's no dedicated envelope section like we have in GR8. And the Juno has sliders instead of knobs, right? So it's the same thing, but different. And depending on what synth you have, things will be differently, knobs, sliders, buttons, whatever, but you gotta get used to those differences. And finally, we get to the LFOs. An LFO, or a low-frequency oscillator, outputs a frequency that is usually below 20 hertz and creates a rhythmic pulse or sweep. It's called low-frequency oscillator because the oscillations, or let's say the rhythm or the frequency, is below 20 hertz, which is super slow, and it is way below the spectrum of human hearing. We can't hear a frequency below 20 hertz. For us, it's mostly clicking, like a clicking sound or some kind of pulse, but we can't actually hear the frequency correctly when it's below 20 hertz, right? So having a device or a modulation source that outputs a kind of a slow rhythmic pulse or sweep is very useful because it can help us control parameters inside a synth. And like it says here, we can use a low frequency oscillator to modulate aspects of musical equipment such as synthesizers to create certain effects. For example, if we use an LFO to affect the pitch of an oscillator, we get vibrato. If we use an LFO to affect the amp level or volume, we get tremolo. And if we use it for the filters or maybe for the oscillator tuning, right, between two oscillators, like the fine tuning, we can get a phasing effect. And those are just 3 examples. I like to think of LFOs as, using this example, let's say that you wanted to automate a certain parameter in your synth. Let's say this knob, right? And imagine you call a friend and you tell him, hey, can you help me like to raise this knob up or down, twist this knob up or down so I can play a patch and get a cool sound? And your friend will say, okay, cool, right? Okay, he's turning the knob and you go like, okay, but turn it faster. And then he does his motion faster, okay? That's the speed or rate of the LFO, okay? One thing is the, let me leave it there. So the LFO will have a certain speed, like your friend, how fast or slow they are turning that knob. They could do it quickly or very slowly, okay? Then the other thing is how much they're turning the knob or the slider up or down. They could be doing a very shallow motion or a very deep motion, right? That is the modulation depth or modulation strength, right? So we have the speed, how fast, the depth or the strength is how deep or how strong that movement is. And finally, well, there are other LFO parameters, but mostly the shape. Let's say if your friend turns that knob, let's say in a symmetric way from left to right, taking the same time to start and to complete the cycle, maybe that shape of the movement he's doing is like a sine wave. But if he were to accelerate to one side or the other, that would be like a square shape, and a triangle wave may be somewhere in between. Okay, so ultimately the shape affects how that parameter turns or is affected. So that kind of motion, whether it's very quick at the beginning and then slows down, or is a constant motion, that will have a different effect on the signal. And different synths will offer different parameters when it comes to shape. For example, GR8, it provides 4 shapes. This is a sine wave shape, I don't remember if this is a triangle or a sawtooth shape, a square shape, and a noise shape, right? But some other ones like pigments here, they may have more shapes, but you can morph between the shapes, so you have more complex movement, and you can have a bipolar, meaning a movement that goes up or down, or versus just up, and you can edit or change the symmetry, the phase, and a whole bunch of parameters. Or it could be very simple, the LFO section in your synth. Some popular LFO destinations, remember the LFO is a source, are pitch. Like I mentioned, if you affect the pitch of an oscillator, you get a vibrato. If you affect the amp volume, you get a tremolo. And if you affect the filter cutoff, this is cool, you can get like a ripple effect or a cyclic opening and closing of the filter. And the cool thing is that you can use LFOs on top of envelopes. It's not like you have to pick one or the other, or, well, maybe depending on your synth, you will not have the flexibility of assigning any envelope and LFO to any destination. But generally, for example, let's say in GR8, you can use an envelope to control the filter, but you can also use the LFO. So you can set up a patch in a way that when you play it, the filter cutoff will follow, let's say, a very fast and plucky envelope, but then the LFO will modulate that LFO to do something to the tail. So you have like two different kinds of automation going on in your sound, which is very cool. And modern synths like Ana 2, Massive, Hive, Serum, Pigments, and many others that I didn't mention here offer many types of advanced LFOs that you can modulate any kind of destination and parameter of your choosing. Some synths, they have what I would call standard LFO shapes like this, but on other ones like Serum and Massive, you can customize your own LFO shapes and actually draw them and pick from various made presets, so you can build even more rhythm and more weirdness if you wanted into your sound design, into your patches. And again, if you like more, I would say, 80s simple kind of stuff, then the more simpler LFO shapes and envelopes will serve you well. But if you're more into sound design and ambient music, or music that sounds more modern, then you're gonna make use of those odd and really customizable LFOs and envelopes. Alrighty, so that comes to the end of the first portion of our video or live stream, where we have covered, just in, let me summarize, the components of a subtractive synthesis system. And I feel that without this understanding, it is very hard to know what you're doing and to get an idea of how to create the sound that you're going for. And like I mentioned various times, every synth graphical user interface will be different. You will find some similarities, of course, but every synth will organize these components wherever they see fit, right? So, but if you approach subtractive synthesis by always thinking of these four main components, we have the sound generator in the form of the oscillator, which will make the sound, and then that sound flows to the frequency shapers or to the filters, where we'll take something away. Then that flows to the amplifier, where the level is boosted. We can have a volume knob, okay? That's the signal flow. And then we have modulators that can be called differently, hard-coded, or could be completely customizable in the modulation matrix, etc. We can use modulators to change or to affect the oscillators, the filters, and the amp over time to fit our sound design needs. All right, so I'm gonna pause here and see if there are any questions that anyone would like me to answer at this point. All right. Cool. The next step is I want to walk you through a very simple synthesizer. Very simple, but it does have some very cool options. And figure out the lay of the land, this signal flow that we just went through. And we'll play some of it along the way. Then we'll make some patches. All right. Okay, so here's the free and awesome GR8, or great as I like to call it. I have initialized this patch, and here's how it currently sounds. Lovely, I know. Okay, so think about our main components, the oscillators or the sound generators. Where's that? Okay, we have the oscillators here, oscillator 1 and 2 on the left, kind of on the center left. All right, cool. Where do we have our filter or our frequency shaping? To the right. Nice, I see the cutoff controls, etc. And where do we have our amp? Oh, to the right of that. So this synth is following the signal flow that I just showed you almost down to the T, right? From left to right, we have oscillators and the filter and then the amp. It will not necessarily be like this on every synth, but that's why I like this one so much. It's very simple. So let's cover some of the options one by one. The oscillator, let me set this to only oscillator 1. With this octave knob, I can control whenever I press down a key, what octave it is played in. Cool. Here, I can select what waveform this oscillator will use. and you'll see the name here, triangle saw, appreciate how much richer and how much more brightness and overtones the saw has as compared to the triangle. Okay, then a pulse wave, then a square wave. Currently, both the pulse and the square sound the same. A square wave, think of it, I know that this may be hard to see this icon down here, but a square, think of it as this kind of wave shape where if you cut down the waveform in the middle, the sides of the square are exactly the same. So mathematically, the cycle, both the positive cycle and the negative cycle, have the same length, or the wave looks the same. However, in a pulse wave, maybe you can see here, maybe you're not, maybe you can't. The positive and the negative cycles, they don't have the same length, right? So it's kind of like taking a square wave and skewing it to one side or the other. Okay, and that's useful. We'll come back to it. That's what we have on oscillator 1. This is cross modulation, but I'm not going to cover it. Oscillator 2, we see the same, or kind of the same wave options, but actually not exactly. Here we have a sine, whereas oscillator 2 didn't. So let's listen to the sine. Very simple, no overtones. We also have a saw, we also have a pulse, and we have noise. Okay, this is cool for creating noise sweeps and that kind of thing. We use the noise oscillator, and depending on your synth, you may have a dedicated noise oscillator for that, or maybe it's within the waveforms that one of the oscillators offers you. You have to look that up and find out where it is. Okay, and oscillator 2, we can detune it from oscillator 1 using musical intervals, semitones. So for example, if I set both oscillators or the mix to 50-50, and I set oscillator 2 to be 7 semitones, this is a perfect fifth. You get this fifth kind of sound. Of course, I could have set this to any other interval I wanted, like an octave can be useful for certain patches, an octave up or an octave down. Whoops. Right, or any other musical interval that I like. This send knob, it controls a fine-tuning or detuning of oscillator 2. Let me put this down to 0, and with an oscillator mix of 50-50 and both oscillators set to the same waveform, when I press a note, it's like only one oscillator is playing, right? We don't hear two voices or two sounds. We can hear a slight phasing. Just one oscillator, but both of them, there's like a slight phasing. The reason for this is that typically, and this applies more in the analog domain, no two oscillators will sound exactly the same, right? There will be variances in the tuning, but if you stack two oscillators that are tuned exactly the same, you will get simply a louder signal. You won't get the benefits of thickening or additional voices. To get the benefit, we will turn our send knob just slowly and hear how we can then start hearing those two voices. Very cool. Here we have thickened up the sound, and listen to how the more that we detune the sound, there is like a beating here, that there's a cyclic thing going on when I detune one oscillator. It's like a phaser turning, kind of like an LFO. And the more that I detune one from the other, the faster that beating gets. Cool. Somewhere around here sounds cool to thicken up your sound. Of course, you could detune as much as you want. To go for a kind of trance lead, you would detune like so. most likely, right? But in any case, it's up to you where you want to detune this. I'm not going to go into these options. And talking about the voices, or the voicing controls and some other global controls, here we have this global octave setting. Here I could determine oscillator 1, what octave it's playing in relation to oscillator 2, but this control raises or lowers the octave of my entire synth. Okay. Then we have what we could call voice or voicing modes. Mono, like I've already explained, I can only play one note at a time. Here I am holding down two notes, but you can only hear one. Okay, and we're hearing the two voices of these these two oscillators are putting out. Unison, it's kind of like mono. I can, at least on this synth, I can only play one note at a time, but we get 8 voices stacked at the same time. It's thicker, it's bigger, bolder, and with this detune control, I can control, let's say, like this end control, determine the detuning between these two oscillators, but now this control will determine the slight detuning between all the voices in the stack. And the spread, in this case, spreads all those voices, those additional voices in the stereo spectrum. So here they sound very mono in terms of stereo placement. So we open it up like so. Great, that's unison. On some other synths, you have unison mode where you can play chords. On this one, unison mode is monophonic. All synths are different. Then we have this chord feature, which is pretty cool. With this chord feature, by only playing one key, I can set it up to play 3 additional notes on top of my root note. So if I play a simple C, currently nothing is happening because all additional 3 notes are also mimicking that same C note. But what happens if this second note, I set it to an interval of 4 semitones? That's a major third, and I'm only playing one note. What happens if I set this third note to an interval of a perfect fifth, which is 7 semitones? I'm playing a major chord with one key only, which is very cool. Right? Gets you that kind of sound. Right? And let's set this to 11 semitones, which is the musical interval or distance of a major 7 actually. We get a major 7 chord, which is pretty cool. By only pressing one key, we get major 7 chords. And of course, I could set this using any other intervals that I like. For example, I could do let's say 5 semitones is a perfect fourth. Then we could do, was it a 12th? Okay, hold on. 2, 3, 4. So I'm getting here some kind of suspended fourth chord with a major 7. Okay, you get the gist. You can set this up to be whatever you like, and it can be very useful. And finally, we have the poly mode, and we can finally play a bunch of notes at the same time and make our own chords. All right, very quickly, with this glide knob or portmanteau, if I press a key, and while still holding down that first key, I press another one, the sound, instead of jumping from one pitch to the next, it will glide in a speed determined by this control. Okay, but let me set it to mono. Or shorter. Or anywhere in between. Cool. So that's pretty much the oscillator and some of the global controls that affect the voicing. Now let's talk about the filter section. Alright, filter section, like we discussed. We're going to find the slope or the steepness or strength of the filter, if you will. We can set it to 24 dB per octave. But nothing is happening. Why? Because the cutoff control is still open. It's still set to the maximum value, so we won't hear any filtering until we start bringing this filter cutoff down. Okay, and here's how different slopes affect the sound. At 24 dB per octave, it is filtering a lot at this value, whatever it is. If I set this at 12 dB per octave, it will let through more highs. Okay, so it's less aggressive than minus 24 dB. Let's check it out. You see, we have a little bit more of the high end coming through. Darker. More aggressive. This lets pass a little bit more of the highs. Okay, cool. The resonance control, peak or Q, it will create a resonant node by boosting the frequencies around the cutoff. And this is also a very typical sound of analog synthesis, where you play with the resonance. For example, with the high resonance, we modulate the cutoff. You get this kind of sound. Squelchy, squeaky, depending on how high you push it. Alright. So that's the resonance, that's the cutoff control. Here we have the key tracking. Like I said, if I set my cutoff here, and I play a note, let's say to the left of the middle of the center of my MIDI controller, listen to how dark it sounds. Okay, now I'm gonna play a high note. It sounds super dark and muffled. Okay, going back to my low note, the high note. But what if I wanted my high note to have just a little bit more of high end, and I don't want to open the filter. I want to leave it where it is. That's where the key tracking control comes into play. Now I'm gonna play the high note and turn the key tracking knob. Okay, cool. Okay, now I can hear it clearly. But what about my original note? It kind of still sounds the same, right? But my high note now has more high end, so that's useful. If I wanted some of my low notes to stay dark, but my high notes to poke through a little bit more, that's what the key tracking is used for. Nice. And here we can modulate the filter cutoff via the LFO or via the envelope. So here's our filter cutoff control. If I turn this knob, we can hear it's being affected by the LFO at a speed like this, right? And this control, what we'll do is how deep or how shallow or how strong the effect of the LFO is on the cutoff filter. If I just turn it up a little, it's very gentle, but if I turn it all the way up, it's super extreme, okay? The speed of the LFO, I can change that here in the LFO section. Okay, and the shape of the LFO section, I can change it here. That's a square. It's like an on and off switch. But here's a sine. Or gradual. What about a saw wave? It has a very sharp attack. And what about noise? Or random? Cool. Alright. And we can also control our filter using the envelope. Which one? We can set that here. So if we leave it to envelope 1, we can set a very slow attack. Can you hear it? You can hear it. Awesome, right? No, you can't hear anything because I've only changed the values of the envelope, but I haven't given it any depth, right? Or any strength. That's what this envelope amount or envelope depth control is for. With the little envelope amount, it's a very gentle movement through the envelope, and more extreme values, obviously more extreme. Great, so that's our filter section. Finally, coming back to our amp, very simple, we have a level, and with this LFO knob, we will assign this LFO, or we will increase the modulation strength or depth of this LFO on our level to create a tremolo effect. For this, let's select a sine wave at a faster rate. Here's very shallow. Cool. And obviously different wave shapes will affect the sound differently. All right. Let's keep going, my friends. The envelope sections are very simple. We just have knobs for the attack, decay, sustain, and release. No surprises here. But we have two additional sections, velo and modify. Now, what are these? Oh, and I just want to point out that you don't see a modulation matrix here, like I showed you in the presentation. And like I also mentioned, we have modulation sources that are already hardwired to affect certain destinations. Like here in the filter section, we have this control for the LFO. I don't have to select LFO being applied to the filter. It's already there by default or hardwired, right? And the same with the amp. This velocity section is also an extension of that idea. It's gonna modulate certain parameters, certain destinations with certain sources. Let's check it out. Okay, so here it's saying, okay, we have this control for filter, and velo stands for velocity. So if you read the manual or if you played with it, what you'll find is that how hard you play a note on your MIDI controller, on your synth keyboard, or program a MIDI note, that's the velocity of the note. So if you use this control, if you turn it all the way to the top, let's say the louder or the higher your MIDI velocity is, then the more the filter will open. Conversely, the lower the velocity of your notes, the less that the filter will be affected by the amp, by the velocity rather. And we also have the same thing for the amp. Okay, so without velocity being routed to the amp, it doesn't matter how loud or softly I play a note, it will always be played back at full volume. And synthesizers from the 60s, 70s, and 80s, some of them had this, that they lacked that expressiveness, right, of being able to play soft notes. And to be able to do that, what we'll do is just turn up this amp control. So now, if I play something softly, you can hear soft and loud, soft and loud, soft and loud. That's what that's for. Then we get to this modify section. Let's see, it says envelope 1, we see the shape of an envelope, but then we see the shape being inverted. Okay, cool. What this control does, like I just mentioned, it will invert the envelope shape. So instead of going from 0 to the top and then going down to the sustain, etc., it goes down just like the goes in the opposite direction. That's useful for certain kinds of sounds. And then we see here a track parameter. It says tracking off envelope 1, envelope 2, and envelope 1 and 2. If I remember correctly, this tracking, similar to the filter key tracking, which means that the higher the notes on the keyboard, the more the filter will open. In this case, what this does is if I set this control to one envelope or the other, or both at the same time, the higher the notes that I play on my keyboard, the faster the cycle of the envelope will be. And conversely, the lower the notes that I play, the slower that the envelope will run. And this is in very tiny amounts. And if you think, for example, of a piano, where the super low notes are very resonant, have a longer decay than the top notes, are darker, right? The envelope on one of these low notes, because of the physicality of the instrument, is slower than if you play a very, very fast note or a very high note on top of at the top of the piano, right? So this control, this modulation feature is trying to help you to get a more realistic sound or feel like that. Not all synthesizers have it, but it's cool that this one does. All right, and finally, we have this pitch and LFO section. Let's first cover the LFO, because I think we've already covered it. The rate, okay, let's assign the LFO to the filter cutoff, like so. Okay, but let me get rid of this. Okay. We'll set the rate here. Okay, the rate could be free running, like I'm doing here, or it could be synced to the tempo of your DAW, your sequencer, or whatever. And that's useful because now the values turn here into subdivisions of meter. For example, 1/3 is a triplet, 5/16, etc., as opposed to these arbitrary values. Sometimes the values for rates, you get them in hertz. Other times, like this one, they are completely arbitrary. So you just turn it until you get the speed or rate that you like. Okay, this fade-in control, not all synths have it in their LFO section, but listen to how, once I've applied the LFO to a parameter, for example, the envelope, when I press the key, you will immediately hear the LFO. Okay, but the fade-in, as its name suggests, it's going to take, or it's going to make the LFO wait a while until it kicks in. It could be called LFO delay or fade-in. Now listen to how when I play the note, we won't hear the LFO until, unless I continue sustaining the note, like so. Okay, let me make this more obvious. Okay, hold on this. Okay. Okay, here. With no fade in, the LFO kicks in immediately. With fade in, it takes a little bit to come in, all the way up. It takes like a second or so. And this can be cool if you have some kind of lead where you want to play fast notes and then sustain just one note and have the LFO kick in. Let's listen to that again. Whereas, if there was no fade in, I couldn't play those fast notes, right? It doesn't get me there. And if the rate was faster, I can't do anything. But let's fade that in. For whatever reason, let's say I like that. Nice. I just want that fluttering towards the tail end of the sound. But without the fade in, I can't do that. Yeah, as a special effect, it sounds pretty cool. Okay, but that's what the fade in control does, and that's why it's useful in the context of affecting not only the filter, but also the pitch. So here we have this pitch section where this is tied to the LFO. Now, I could transpose the pitches of both of my oscillators at the same time, okay, or I could use the LFO to affect the pitch. And on which oscillator? 1, 2, or both? Okay, let's modulate both oscillators with the LFO. Cool, there I am modulating the pitch. Okay, this is a kind of vibrato. What if I only modulated one oscillator, not the other? It's very detuned. Of course, I'm using extreme values here, but if you wanted both at the same time or just one or the other, you have that. Okay, cool. Now, in this pitch section, I could also route envelope 1 to control either the pitch of oscillator 1, 2, or both of them. So let's set this to oscillator 1. Let me bring this down. Okay, no modulation. Let me push this up. Now, envelope 1 is going to control the modulation of oscillator 1. Let me increase the release on the amp. Those are the laser sounds from the sci-fi movies of the 40s, 50s. Alright, so that's modulating the pitch via envelope and via LFO. Cool. And let me see if there was anything I missed here. For the most part, well, in this pitch bend wheel and this modulation, you can assign both of these wheels to affect the pitch in certain values and the filter. And this one, you can bend the pitch up or down while also affecting the filter, right? And not all synths do. Most modern synths offer a host of different effects. For example, the usual suspects like chorus and delay. And reverb, etc. Cool or cool? All right. That's step 2 of what I wanted to cover today. And I love GR8 because how simple it is, but it's super powerful. If you know what you're doing, for me at least, the architecture and the sounds that it offers, you can very much get into the ballpark of a Juno, Jupiter, Prophet 5, and an OBX, Oberheim OBXD or OBXA very easily because of the 2 oscillators that it offers, the 2 envelopes, the very nice sounding chorus, etc. To me, this is like a very cool Jupiter, Juno, Prophet 5 emulation. All right, next up, let's make some patches putting to use some of the knowledge that we have right now. And then after that, I'll walk you through my best methods for learning how to develop your synthesis skills. So let's reset this patch. Let me bring it back to poly mode. All right. So let's think of a patch. Let's say we are going to make a warm kind of pad. Okay. When we say warm, that is already suggesting that we need to take away some of the high end or some of the highest harmonics, some of the brightness, right? So we're going to use a filter for that. Then also, generally a pad, well, let's say it could have a fast or a slow attack, but let's say we want our pad to have like a medium attack. We also wanted to overlap notes as we play different chords. So that translates into a medium or long release in the amp. Now, when it comes to the oscillators, we can make a pad with one oscillator, with two, with a sawtooth wave, with a square wave, with a pulse wave. Pretty much any wave we have available will work. It's just a matter of figuring out which tone and timbre character we had in mind, right? But let's give it a try and see how it goes. All right. So we said in terms of oscillators, we could use one or two. For this case, let's just use two oscillators. Set the mix to 50-50. So let's start from the noise, sound generation components or part. Then let's move to the filter, the frequency shaping, and then the amp. Okay, so this is our sound now. Okay, we're using a little bit of detuning here to thicken up our sound. Cool. And we could go with square waves. That's cool, but let's stick to... Well, you know what? Let's pick a saw wave on one oscillator and a pulse wave on the other. Cool. And that's the only thing that I want to do in terms of the oscillators, nothing else. And I'm going to make sure that it's set to poly mode, right? Because if it were set to mono, couldn't play any chords. The same with unison and chords. I want to make my own chord. So poly mode is what I'm looking for. So that's pretty much for the sound generation aspect of the patch design. Then let's move over to the filter. Like I said, I want this to be a warm pad. So we got to take away frequencies. Cool. So for that, we could certainly use any of these slopes. Let's just pick the one in the middle, minus 18 or 18 dB per octave. Well, nothing is happening. Why isn't nothing happening? Because the filter cutoff control is completely open, or it's at its maximum point, meaning the filter isn't doing anything to our sound. So let's just close the filter or bring the filter cutoff down until we get the sound to a place where we like, where it feels warm, not so harsh like so. And I'm not looking here at the values because these values are arbitrary. Sometimes your synth will show values in hertz. So maybe this would be 500 hertz or, I don't know, 70 hertz, whatever. Other times they have an arbitrary value, like on this one from 0 to 100. So that doesn't tell me anything. I need to use my ears. So here, that's cool. I'm not going to use any resonance for now. And just so my patch doesn't get too bassy, I don't want too much bass, I'm going to use this high pass filter to cut out some of the lows. And again, I'm just using my ears and turning this to a point where I like it. Right about there. Okay. So that's the filter, the frequency shaping portion of the sound design piece. We'll get back to it once we use the filters. But now let's get to the amp section. Here, there's nothing I want to do. Oh, you know what? Yeah. Let's change the volume of our patch just a little bit as we sustain notes. What I'm going to do is set this control to an extreme value just so I can clearly hear it and then bring it down to a more gentle spot. I just want to listen to the rate. Obviously, that's too much for what I want to do right now. Okay, here, then now I'm going to bring down the LFO amount. So I want it to be very gentle, not like this, not like a tremolo. So here, okay, that's cool. Okay, now let's set up the modulation sources to affect our filter and the amp. I said that I wanted this pad to have like a medium to slowish attack on the amp, and also wanted a medium to slow release. So on this synth, envelope 2 is hardwired to the amp. I can't change that, but I can change the filter, which envelope is affecting it by moving the slider. The amp is hard-coded to envelope 2. So I'm gonna set this, and I'm playing my keyboard and feeling the attack. I'm not looking at the values here because they're arbitrary. I like it here. Okay. The sustain, I want the sustain to not be at full all the time. And remember what I mentioned. If the sustain is at the top of its travel, or the maximum value, this decay doesn't do squat. But if the sustain is something other than 100%, the decay does do something. Listen to how the decay creates like this, almost like a whipping sound, like when the level transitions from attack to sustain. Pay attention. If it's too fast, it's a clicking sound, which I don't want. I don't want the whip. So I will increase the decay until I can't hear that whip anymore. I can still hear it there. Right? Okay, right there I've softened that whip, or gotten rid of it. So now it has a more gentle attack, then it decays to the sustain without the whip. Now that whip is useful in certain situations, but not with what I'm going for right now. Now, what about the release? As I let go, my sound is dying. I don't want that. Okay, release halfway sounds better to me. There. Cool. Very nice. Now, let's work on the filter some more. I want the filter to move slower than the amp. So for this, we need to make sure that we have first a second envelope that can control the filter independently of the amp, and that we have routed it correctly. So here, envelope 2 is hardwired to the amp. I want to use envelope 1 for the filter, so I'll make sure that the slider is all the way here. Cool. And remember that unless I turn up this envelope modulation amount, we're not going to hear any change on our filter. Right? No change whatsoever. Okay, let's start with mimicking the amp, and then we'll tweak it from there. I'm going to set the amount here. I don't know how bright or dark it's going to sound. I'll tweak from here. Okay, first off, I don't want the sound to get so bright. I just want a little bit of the filter high-end and harmonics to shine through, but not so much. Of course, the more I raise this, that burst of white noise at the beginning is more apparent, more extreme, but I don't want it so much. So I'm going to bring down the envelope modulation amount. Okay, right here is cool. But now, I want this action to be slower than the envelope. So I'm gonna slower the attack by increasing it. Nice. So now we're getting this swell of sound. Cool. And do I want this swell, this wave of white noise to sustain, or do I want it to die out on its own? Let's say that I want it to die out, okay? I don't want it to continue going forever. So for that, I'm gonna bring the sustain all the way down. Then how long it takes for that wave to die down after the attack, that's gonna be controlled by the decay, as long as I'm holding down my notes. So let's check it out. I'm gonna make the envelope amount a little more apparent, just so we can tweak the decay. Okay. What if I made the decay faster? There's the whip again, right? I don't want that, but that could be cool. You know what? First off, let's activate the chorus, and let's activate the delay. And listen to this whipping motion. It creates a very cool effect. You hear it in stereo. Without the delay, it's kind of annoying. Right, but with delay, it's very useful. It creates more movement in the patch. Let me get rid of the... Okay, so let's continue tweaking the decay. It's still too fast. Cool. Maybe longer. That's cool. That swell comes in and then dies out. If we had a sustained value, the swell wouldn't die out. It's there. Cool. Now, what about the release? Okay, I'm gonna set a longer release than the amp, just to make sure that when I let go of the keys, the filter doesn't die out quicker than the amp. Cool. And from here, we could do a bunch of things, but I'm gonna leave it as it is. And we could experiment with only sawtooth waves, or only with square waves, and change the width of the pulse via this control. Okay, one more thing that I want to dive into before just doing one quick patch and getting to the final chapter of our time together today is, when we were talking about the oscillators, I showed you squared waves and we talked about the pulse wave, but I didn't do anything with that. Let me go back to, let me reset this thing. Okay, let me go to mix one. Okay. This is what a square wave sounds like. And this is our pulse wave. They sound exactly the same. The reason is that the starting point of this pulse wave is exactly 50-50, such as the square wave. So we don't hear a difference. We will hear a difference once we modulate, or once we change the width of this pulse. And we can do that in two ways. We can create a static change, or we can create a modulating change of the pulse width. Let's first address the static change. If we go to this section here, PWM, which stands for pulse width modulation, as its name suggests, we will be able to modulate the width of our pulse. And I have three controls, or three options. The first option is modulating the pulse width with this width control. So with the control all the way down, I don't hear anything, but as I turn the control up, I hear it change. Okay, so I call it static pulse width modulation because I'm just setting a width differently than 50/50, but it's not moving. It stays there. Once I set the control to a certain width, it doesn't move. So it's like a different kind of square wave, or if I had more waves here that I could select, because these waves don't move either. They're static. Okay, but just hear how different this position sounds. This is very blocky. While down here, it sounds more like a typical square wave. Okay. Cool, so this is setting the width using a static approach. But what if I wanted the width to change over time, like so? Immediately, in your head, you should be jumping, oh, use an LFO for that, or use an envelope. Yeah, cool. And those are the other two options that we have here, which is if I set the control to this, then the width or this movement is going to be controlled by the LFO. And if I set this control to a different position, I get a different timbre. So I have a huge range of options here. Okay, this is pulse width modulation. And finally, I could modulate the pulse with an envelope. So for example, envelope number 1. Let's bring up this control. And let me tweak envelope 1 so we can hear it. Right now it's hard to hear because it's very fast. There you can hear like a walk, wow. So instead of being a constant motion like with the LFO, it's just one, like one turn, one whip. Whoop. That's pretty much what you get. But that's very useful. So it's now like a very slow one-time wah-wah, right? Cool. And of course, there's many different timbres you can achieve with this. Very cool. All right, let's see what else, my friends. We're making great progress here. One more thing. Let me show you how to create a kind of piano patch before going to the final chapter of our call today. Let me set this back to poly. And let's think of a piano. Maybe you've never played a real piano before, but let me tell you this. When you strike the key of a piano, the sound is immediate. So that tells us that the amp is as fast as it can go. Okay? If I let go of the key of a piano without holding down one of the pedals, the sound will die out immediately. So that tells me that the release of the amp has to be fast. Okay, now that gives us clues as to how to program a piano resembling patch. Okay, so we know that the amp has to be ultra fast, the release has to be very quick or immediate. Another thing, if you play a piano note and you hold on to it, you sustain it, it will not go on forever, unlike a synth. So it means that the sustain, it has no sustain, at least from an ADSR perspective, which means that the decay parameter in the amp is going to control how long the note is going to take to die out. All right? So let's start playing with, at least with this idea for now. Okay, my note is very sharp and fast, cool. And when I release, it dies out. Okay, so that part of the envelope of a piano, the amp envelope of the piano is already sounding good, but I'm pressing my note, sustaining it, but the note is dying out on me very quickly. So I need to increase the decay. I know for a fact that's too long for a piano. I can't tell you if it's 1.2 seconds or 1.93. So I'm just gonna adjust this by ear. Yeah, I think somewhere in the ballpark of that. Yeah. And here's where the concept of the keyboard tracking or the key filter tracking comes into play. Why? Because if you play a note higher up on a piano, it will have way, way less sustain and decay than a note down low. So one of the really low notes, it will resonate longer, whereas one of the high-pitched notes, it will die out very quickly, right? We could mimic that with the tracking option here, but I'm not gonna complicate myself with that, right? But at least our envelope, I think it's in very great shape when it comes to the amp. Now, thinking of the notes of a piano, well, we could say it's sawtooth waves or square waves. It doesn't matter for me. This piano sound, I'm gonna leave it as it is with oscillator, with sawtooth waveforms, and consider that a piano. Oh, you know what? No, let's do something different. The note of a piano isn't as rich as a sawtooth. It's more defined. It doesn't have as many overtones. Yeah, it's bright. It has definition. So for that, let's just use one square wave oscillator, kind of like this. Okay, but now this sounds like Nintendo. Let me set the width to a different place. Okay, I like it there, you know. That's fine. And in terms of the filter, it's completely open, so we aren't doing anything. For the most part, I think this sounds pretty good for a piano kind of patch. Just for the sake of it, let's activate the filter and use the envelope to give a little bit of attack to the notes. Let's set this to envelope 1, and let's tweak the attack. No sustain. Let's set a release just like the amp. Let's open up the decay a little bit. A very short release, decay rather, gives us this very plucky muted sound, which is cool. Cool, but it's not what I'm going for. So I'm gonna give it more decay. Oh, not this one, the filter. And you know what? If I wanted to make matters simpler for myself, if I'm gonna end up with a envelope 1 shape that looks the same as envelope 2, I might as well just do this and call it a day. Right? Cool. And as icing on the cake, let's enable the usual suspects, such as the chord. Nice. What about delay? And some reverb, or a lot of reverb. This is a very nice sound. Oh man, lovely. Very cool. Cool. All right, finally, let me show you my best approach for learning how to program patches and how to develop your subtractive synthesis skills. Certainly watch this a few times just so you understand all the theory that we covered during the, let's say, the academic part of the presentation or of today's video, because it's important to know that you first generate a sound in the oscillators, then you shape its frequency content with the filters, finally it gets amplified, and you have the modulators, them being the envelope and the LFO, to control different aspects of those three, the oscillators, the filters, and the amps, to further shape your sound and make it behave the way that you want it to behave. Cool. But how do you develop your synthesizing skills? This is my best approach, and it's a very, very simple approach. This is what I suggest. Get yourself a few patches or a patch bank, whatever. Browse your patches on a very simple synth. Don't try to do this on Serum or some of those, or Hive, some of those synths that have super complicated patches. Hopefully, actually, I recommend this. Get a copy of GR8, which is free. You can download that and use my sound bank the way that I'm going to use it, which is also free. You can download at synthwavedojo.com. Or if you can't use GR8 on a Mac because you have VST3 instead of audio units, then download PG8X, which is also free, and I have a sound bank for that. And if not, I think you may have Tau Uno, and I have a sound bank for Tau Uno. In any case, use one of my sound banks because most of my sounds are very simple and they work very well for what I'm going to show you. And you simply browse the patches in the bank. Let me go with something very simple, some kind of maybe piano sound. Okay, this one will work just fine. Okay, and do this. However, you can do this on your computer. Take a screenshot of the synth, okay? And in my case, I'm gonna paste this on a Word document. You can paste this on a Google Doc, whatever other app you have, or just download the screenshot and then open up the screenshot somewhere. The easiest way that you can do this, the best that it will be. Okay, so I know that this is like the face of the synthesizer, okay? But I also have an effects tab, so let me take a screenshot of this as well. I'm gonna paste that here. All right, and now what I will do is I'm gonna come back to the synth, initiate the synth, and one by one, I will go back and forth between my screenshot and the patch, and I will recreate it knob by knob. And I'll be thinking along the way what the effect of those steps are, right? And of course, I can't have a memory to know exactly. Once I'm done with this exercise, I can't know if I got exactly the same result. I can try to if you create a session in your DAW and have one, let's say, one version of the synth, one instance of the synth with a patch, program a note, and then you fire up another instance, and that way, if you do that, you can compare. But just to do something very quick like this, like I said, we'll initialize the patch, then I'll just go back and forth between the screenshot and my patch, and I'll start tweaking knobs. First the oscillators, then the filters, then the amp, then the modulators, right? And the global controls or the global voicing control, we'll see about that, and we'll leave FX for last. Okay, so now let me take a look at this patch. It says oscillator 1. It doesn't seem to be using the octave. It's set to sawtooth wave, no cross modulation. Cool. Oscillator 2 set to sawtooth wave. Okay, cool. The semi is exactly where I am. The send knob seems to be just a little higher. Okay, but I'm gonna play. That's the first change that I did, but nothing is changing. Why? Because this mix balance control, or this oscillator balance, okay, it's got to be set to 50-50. Now I can hear the difference between my original position and sent. Okay, it's a little more detuned in my final patch. And what I'm doing there to go back and forth is, at least on Windows, you can do Control Tab, Alt Tab. It's a keyboard shortcut to go back and forth. On Mac, you have something different, similar, I don't know, Apple Tab or Command Tab, whatever. Cool. So, the oscillator, that's pretty much it. Let me bring the level down. Okay, cool. Now, what about the global control? The octave is set here. It's set to poly mode. That's pretty much I need to know. Okay, nothing new there. Now, what about the filters? Okay, cool. The filter is set to slope of minus 24 dB. So let's do that. No change. Cutoff is set to around 30. Cool. Resonance, no resonance. No LFO. Okay, this is routed to envelope 2. And envelope control is here. Cool. I still can't hear much. We'll see when this thing comes alive. I don't know if I made a mistake. We'll see. Okay, let's move on and over to the envelope section. Okay, the attack set to 0. The decay here. Sustain set to 0. Release to around here. For whatever reason, this sounds super dark to me. I don't know why. We'll see later. Ah, okay. Got it. Now I know why. And this is the kind of thing why this is cool. I wasn't applying any envelope amount. Silly me. Okay. There we go. All right. Level. All right. Release. That's where it is. Modify section. The filter section is the same. Okay, so this is our first version of the patch without effects. Now, what about the effects? Okay, I see here chorus, delay, and reverb. That doesn't matter so much. The chorus does matter. Rate, spread, mix. Yeah, we're kind of there. And the delay and the reverb, we can tweak it to taste or to distaste. Or to our lack of taste. So let me get rid of the reverb. And that's our patch. Now, we have done this once. What I would recommend for this kind of patch is we initialize it again and then copy it over once more, but trying to think about the parameters that we just that we just changed, right? And then you do it a third time and see if you can do it by memory. So once you can kind of get this basic sound by memory, right? That's when you know that you're developing your skills. So let me see if I can get back to this point almost kind of by memory. I know that it was plucky while I still have that fresh in my mind. We set the oscillators to 50-50. I remember there was a little bit of a detuning. Both were set to sawtooth, if I'm not mistaken. Okay. Our filter slope was set to 24. I think our cutoff was halfway there. We were using envelope 2 to control both the amp and the filter. And it was brighter, so I need to push up my envelope amount. Okay, so there I think it's in a right direction. And I think it had no sustain, but a little bit more of a decay. And think it had more release a little bit. Don't remember. It's very much like a piano kind of patch, which I showed before. And I think if we activate the chorus, we are very close. And now once you do this for memory, from memory, we can go back and check our work, if you will. Oscillator section, sawtooth, descent, yeah, very close. The mix, 50-50. What about the filter? The filter here was just a little darker, but it had more of an envelope amount, so this is a wash. Well, I can see here that we had a key tracking, which I didn't use, but that's fine. Doesn't matter too much. Filter cutoff being controlled by the amp. Let's see how I set this amp from memory. The original, fast, kind of at 6 o'clock, well, 2 o'clock, no sustain, release at 12 something maybe. Yeah, very much I set it from memory the way that I had done it here. There you go. So this is a way to understand, slowly recreate patches from synth sound designers that you like. And when you're copying over the patch, think about what the different controls are doing. And as you do that, also experiment with taking the controls to more extreme values. So for example, what were to happen if I were to set the decay faster? Okay, if I take this exact sound, but make the attack actually, and set it halfway, what happens? Oh cool, this is kind of like a pad. And it has that kind of whipping motion. So in my memory, I can file in that if I just take any kind of plucky piano sound and increase the attack, I can turn it into a kind of a pad. So a pad and a piano are not too far apart from each other. It's mostly tweaking the amp envelope. Okay, cool. Okay, and what if I were to change another parameter? Let's say where we're at right now. What happens if I turn the sustain all the way up? Okay, this is very cool. It's not as controlled as it used to be. It's now way louder, obviously louder, but sounds more and more open, more energetic. Okay, cool. Let's bring it to where it was. And what happens if I increase the release on both the amp and the filter? Oh, when I let go, the sound keeps on going. Cool. Oh, nice. So all from the same starting position, like piano kind of sound, if we tweak it here and there, we can create a wide range of different timbres and different textures. And like I said, as you do this, if you set aside 10, 15, 20 minutes every day and work on the same patch, copy it over 2 or 3 times, then try to do it from memory until a point where you can sit down and say, I'm going to recreate that piano kind of patch. And when you can do it from memory, that's when you're really off to the races. And if you do this enough with leads, with basses, with pads, and with special effects, patches, etc., you'll start to get a feel and connecting your ear to your eyes and your fingers, how you can get a certain sound from a synthesizer. Like, what does the envelope shape of a pad look like, right? Right off the bat, you can say maybe this looks good because the release is long, but for a pad, the attack is way, way, way too short. We would need at least a medium or slow attack. Oh yeah, now that's more akin to a pad. Cool. And you'll start connecting all of these dots, right? And when you also start experimenting with a certain patch and then twisting the parameters to extreme values, also make a mental note of what those things do, right? And if you do this, like I said, 15, 20 minutes a day, recreate patches that you like, all of a sudden you see that you start making a lot of your own patches and you save them. And it's like you have in your memory like a visual, an image of what a bass patch looks like, what a warm kind of pad patch looks like, and so on and so forth. And that's how you build your internal library of patches, by recreating the patches of others and getting in your fingers, as I like to call it, what knobs to twist and to turn for specific changes in your sound. All right, my friends, with this, we come to the end of this super duper very long session of understanding subtractive synthesis and getting solid fundamentals. So from here on out, you can put all this to great use and learn to program patches, hopefully sometime down the road. All right, my friends, let me see if there are any questions here or any comments. Thank you very much, guys, for being here. Robert, Enrique, Nibelstein, Ninja Owl, Philip, Fabio, Justin. I see Philip K. The only problem with presets is you have to remove all the effects and mix them with your composition in most cases. That is a great point, Philip K, and I assume Philip K. Dick. That's one of the reasons why I mostly use my own patches. Very often, not all the time, but very often, the patches that you purchase in sound banks are designed to wow you into purchasing those patches. So if you select like a pad patch, it will have tons of LFOs and envelope movements and a lot of bells and whistles, just so you purchase the sound bank. But then when you're trying to fit that into your arrangement or in your production, you find out that you can't. You have to deactivate a whole bunch of stuff and tweak a whole bunch of stuff that, if you know what you're doing, you can get to that point faster than having to deactivate and undo those patches, right? That's why I agree with you. I don't like most sound banks out there, and also because they have a lot of fluff, a lot of patches that you can't fit them in any kind of production. Especially when I hear Synthwave sound banks, it's like, and I browse the patches, I've never heard anyone use that kind of patch in Synthwave at all. So why are you putting that in a Synthwave sound bank? Boggles the mind. But in any case, if you do this very often, you'll get a feel for how to make these patches. So in your productions, when you're composing or arranging, if you say, I want a warm pad, you don't need to spend 30 minutes browsing your sound banks, finding the one that you had in mind, because very quickly you can get to that point, or at least any 20, come to a create a patch that almost sounds the way that you like it, right? And especially, it's kind of a pet peeve of mine. Let's say that you want a lead sound with oscillator sync, and it's a very specific kind of sound. And if the patches in the sound bank are not labeled like pad, lead, oscillator sync, if they have cute names like John Hughes, straight from the 80s, cool lead, then you're gonna spend days just trying to find an oscillator sync lead patch, because you can't find it anywhere because the patches don't have any of that in their name, right? I'm not gonna go down that path any further. But in any case, once you get good at applying what I've showed you today, and most of my patches, when you reverse engineer them, you'll find that you can fit them mostly into any Synthwave production, because I've created patches that I know that I can use in a Synthwave production, as opposed to wowing you into purchasing my sound banks because they're free in any case. But I know that you can fit them in. But once you reverse engineer the patches like I showed, you'll see that for the most part, all of these patches, most of them sound great, and they are super, super simple. Simple stuff, a modulation via LFO here and there, just careful usage of the envelopes, but it's nothing weird, out of the ordinary, tons and tons of, I don't know, strange synthesis moves. No, it's mostly square waves and sawtooth waves with gentle, I don't know, with careful thought of the filters and the envelopes. And just with that, you can make like so many patches that sound really good. You don't have to turn into a synthesis wizard. But in any case, do give all of this that I showed you today a try. Try out my method for developing your synthesis skills. And if you have any questions, let me know. I'm always available, and I would be very glad to talk synths with you, synthesis, and how to get certain kinds of sounds from this very simple starting point. And really love this. And thank you very much, guys, for sticking it out with me for like 2 hours plus. I knew this was going to be a very long live stream, just because I did want to put out there what I consider to be the fundamentals of subtractive synthesis. So if you absorb all of this, you can make all the patches that you want. Later down the line, I will be talking about wave sequencing synthesis, wavetable synthesis, but without a solid understanding of subtractive synthesis, how this works, it's very hard to grasp wave sequencing and wavetable synthesis, and maybe even down the line, frequency modulation, or FM. Without this understanding, it's going to be very hard to do that. In any case, I hope you guys enjoyed this, and I'm going to let you go. Thank you very much for being here, my friends. Alrighty.